All right, so if you take a look at the 1.1 note sheet, and as many of you guys are noticing, totally different, right? We're talking geometry now here. Points, lines, and planes, I know. So I think this is a good opportunity to start fresh, but in doing so, whenever you start something fresh, you need to have common vocabulary. So the first couple of days or couple of lessons, we'll just be talking about notation and some vocabulary, things like that. So I'm going to go through the notes here. And the very first thing, we're going to start off with the most basic parts of geometry: points, lines, and planes. Those are the three what are called undefined terms. Everything else we can define, but those points, lines, and planes are things that, in terms of geometry, we just kind of describe them. Now, all the geometry that we do is called geometry on a plane, or planar geometry, or sometimes referred to as Euclidean geometry, because our man Euclid was the one that kind of put all this together. But of these three things, a point is simply a designation somewhere in space. And so you just put a dot anywhere on the chalkboard, that's a point. Okay. Whereas a line is a number of points that are strung together. In fact, an infinite amount of points. So one thing that's important about a line is that it is infinite. It goes on forever. And so because it goes on forever, when we notate that, and we'll do some examples, when we, like this is line AB right here, okay? When we do notation, we can't just write AB, but we have to put this line above it with arrows on both sides. And now the order doesn't matter. You could call it line AB, or you could call it line BA, and those two things mean the exact same thing. Yes, Bob?
What's that little squiggly dude?
Little squiggly dude. This little squiggly dude,
Yeah.
that says line L. So there's a couple ways that you could name this line. Sometimes there's just like a random letter out there that's not really a point. So you could call that line L. But I think the best way is to describe it using 2 points, like line AB or line BA. Okay? And then last but not least is a plane. Now we're not talking about the ones that fly in the air, but a plane is a flat surface. Like the chalkboard, like your desk. Okay, those are planes. So when I said originally, for a point, you just put a point somewhere on the chalkboard. Well, the chalkboard is the plane. So in terms of notation, okay, we're going to write down some specific things in terms of notation. We have this shape right here. It's difficult to draw three-dimensional shapes. So this is the best, rendering we have of that. The shaded part is the plane. And we have a line sticking through that. So three-dimensionally, like this line is not on the plane. It's like sticking through the plane. So if we want to give 2 other names for line CD, here's line CD. I can use any 2 letters. So I could call that line CB. But remember, I have to put the line over it. So you should write that down, okay? So we could call it line CB, because CB and CD, because lines are infinite, they both mean the same thing. They're both talking about this shape here. We could also call it line DC. We could call it line BC. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways it only asks us to name 2 different ways, but we can come up with a number of different ways to call that line. The same, they all mean the same thing. Now for a plane, there's a couple of ways to call a plane. First, plane H, that's just referring to this, like Violet S, just kind of that random letter that's hanging out there. But usually when we define planes, we use 3 letters and 3 letters that don't go on the same line. So for example, I would not want to use C, B, and D, but if I said I could call this plane, and I'm going to use C, B, and F. Okay, that would be one way to name that plane. Any 3 letters that don't line up. So I could call that plane. What else could we do? FDB. But if I tried to call it plane CBD, that's no good. Because C, B, and D are all on the same line, or what's called collinear. So that's the next part B here. It says name 3 points that are collinear. All right, well, think about what that word means. Linear means line, right? Linear means line. And co means together. So co-linear are points that are on the same line. So for example, C, B, and D are collinear. I should separate those by a comma there. C and B and D are collinear. They're all on the same line. So collinear means on the same line. Coplanar means on the same plane, like the same flat surface. So we could say like C, B, F, and D okay, C, B, F, and D, those are all coplanar. Notice the oddball was Q. I had to leave that out because Q is not coplanar with the other ones.
What's coplanar?
Yeah, coplanar means on the same plane. Okay, so co means the same, and planar means plane. So coplanar means on the same plane. All right, good questions. Any other questions? All right, let's keep rolling then, okay? So our 3 undefined terms were point, line, and plane. And now for that line, we're going to talk about different portions of a line, like a segment and a ray. Those are parts of a line. Because remember, lines go on forever. So if we want to cut that off, we could talk about a segment. Okay, so a segment or a line segment is part of a line. It has 2 endpoints. So here's an example of a segment that has 2 endpoints. So it has a left end and a right end. Lines go on forever, though. Segments do not. Segments are finite, meaning they end, as opposed to infinite, which means they don't end. So if we want to name this segment over here, we could name it segment AB. So remember, we need the little segment, but notice no arrows on the end, right? Because the segment does not go on forever. So we don't put arrows on the end when we name it. We also can change the order and call it segment BA. Now, array is kind of what you get when the line and the segment have babies. You know, lines go on forever in both directions. Segments have endpoints on both sides. Array has an endpoint on one side. So array, like in this case, that A is an endpoint, but on the right side of it, it goes on forever. In that case, the order is really important. The endpoint always comes first when you name that. So we can only name this Ray AB. You cannot name it Ray BA. It cannot be named Ray BA. If it's a Ray, the endpoint has to come first. So if you have two rays that are going in opposite directions, so like here we have opposite rays. So two rays that have the same endpoint form opposite rays. So we have CA means I start at C and go through A. That is ray CA. Maybe I'll trace that in red. That's ray CA. And ray CB means I start at C and go through B. Okay, so again, notice that C is the endpoint for both of those. All right, so let's give another name for. She is. All right, let's give another name for segment YZ. So if I have segment YZ right here, I could also call that, that's not YZ, sorry, that's YZ. I could also call that segment ZY. Don't forget when you name it. Put the segment above it, no rays, no arrows on the end of it, okay? So to name all of the rays with endpoint V, if I started at V and went this way, I could call that ray VX. If I started at V and went to the right, I could call that ray VZ. If I started at V and went towards W, I could call that ray VW. And then VY would be going off and to the left. Point is, guys, notice that V has to be the first letter if you're talking about a ray. All right, we're still doing okay? All right, well, what I'm going to do is give you guys a couple of minutes to kind of practice that and do these problems. And then we will go over these together. Okay, so you're doing these 4 right here. Let's just take maybe 4 or 5 minutes to do that. And then we'll go over that together in just a minute. Okay, as we go over this, be really careful and specific about your notation. Just having the right letters is not necessarily enough. You know, you got to be real specific about notation. So for example, the first one says, give one other name for MN, and notice this has a line over it. So line MN, that's this guy right here, okay? So I can choose any 2 points on that. So I could call it line, I could switch the order, NM. But I have to have a line with 2 arrows above it. If you do not have this line with 2 arrows above it, it would not be marked correct on an assessment. You have to have that, okay? That's what that means. There's a number of ways you could have, there are a lot of different ways you could have answered that. You could have said NP, You don't have to write all these down, guys. I'm just gonna give you some other ones. You could have said line NP. You could have said line PN. You could have said line PM. So you have all these different possibilities, and there are others as well. Okay? So those are all answers for the line. Now for the plane, the plane is kind of difficult to visualize sometimes. The plane is like the gray part. This segment right here is supposed to be indicating like a line going through the plane three-dimensionally. Like T is above the gray part and W is below it. So that three-dimensional is a little difficult to see sometimes. But if we have for plane A, if I want to name that, I could say it's plane, and I'm going to pick three letters, M, V, and N. You want to pick three letters that are on the gray part, on the same plane, but not collinear. So you do not want to pick like M, N, and P.
Would we put all four of the ones that are on the?
Yeah, good question. Usually when you name planes, you only use the one letter as the plane or three letters. So don't use four letters, okay? Even though I can tell from your question, you know what you're talking about, proper notation would say only three letters. So for number 2, 3 points that are collinear, you could say M, N, and P are collinear. That means on the same line, okay? You also could say T, N, W. Okay, you don't need to do them both, by the way, but that would also be a correct answer. 3 points that are coplanar. Well, that's kind of like naming the plane. So M, V, and N would be 3 coplanar points, meaning on the same plane. So if I'm looking at the gray plane, I do not want to include W because that's below the plane. I do not want to include T, that is above the plane. All right, last but not least, if I want to name all endpoints, rays with endpoint N. It says endpoint N, it's really, think of it as kind of a beginning point as opposed to an endpoint. So we're talking about anything that starts from N, like that would be one example. That would be one example. That would be one example. And that would be one example. So any of those, I guess it wants us to name all of them. So we could say NT. Now notice I have to have above here the ray symbol. If you don't have that, that would not be marked correct. So I could do ray NT, ray NP, ray NW, or ray NM. All right, any questions, guys?